So first and foremost, it's about policy change within the context of landscape. And I think the important point there is landscape isn't just about views, it's not about what you see. We talk a lot about landscape scale, and that doesn't just mean big. I mean, it's more complex than that. Landscape is fundamentally about the relationship between the land and people. And if you're going to develop policy effectively, you have to factor in that relationship between land and people. So what's with the power of woodland? Why do they occupy such an important part of our psyche? Does everyone feel the same way? And firstly, I'm pretty sure that not everyone does feel the same way, and will not anymore, may have done in the past. However, there have been some pretty compelling theories that set out the case for some hardwired responses to our environment. Particularly those of a biologist called E.O. Wilson, who talked about the theory of biophilia. And biophilia describes the connection that humans have with the natural environment. And we subconsciously seek to make that connection with the rest of life. He proposed that humans have a deep affiliation with nature and that these are actually rooted in our biology. We have a hardwired response to our environment. J. Appleton took it a step further forward, and you may have come across him with his prospect refuge theory. There's lots of theories out there, which predicts that humans are attracted to art and circumstances, and by circumstances he means places, that have a number of important features. Broad, uninterrupted vistas, visible places for easy refuge, such as a copse or a cave, water, plants and prey species. And it further predicts that we should like spaces where we're at the edge of something. We're covered, we're protected, we haven't got any open space above our heads. And actually the Woodland Edge is your perfect prospect refuge place. So in short, the proposal is that we have a hardwired genetic response to our habitat. It's nothing more complex than that. And if we presume that those that identified habitat correctly in the past survived to reproduce, then it makes sense that we've all got some kind of hardwired response to our habitat, to our environment. If you're going to go away with a message in relation to influencing policy, then you have to understand clearly that relationship between people and place. You've got to bring people on board. You've got to find a way of actually gaining some kind of consensus as to how you want to move forward. You can't do it in isolation. Policy cannot be written from an office isolated from the people whose land it is. So get to grips with that relationship between people and place, and use the passion that exists in that relationship to drive forward a consensual change. James Hillman, the American psychologist, remarked, "Psychology, so dedicated to awakening human consciousness, needs to wake itself up to one of the most ancient human truths. We cannot be studied or cured apart from the planet." This is echoed in the basic sort of tenets of eco-psychology, which states there's a deeply bonded and reciprocal relationship between humans and nature. The illusion of separation of humans and nature leads to suffering, both for the environment as ecological devastation and for humans as grief, despair and alienation. So there was a strong realisation that there was a really serious connection between humans and nature. So there's an accepted train of thought that links our thoughts genetically with the environment. And secondly, a suggestion that we ignore this connection at our peril. And it's not just our psychological peril, it's our ecological peril too. But how does woodland fit in? Why is it so important? I want to take you back to the 6th century BC, okay? It was the ancient Greeks, and we know that a lot of this is attributed to Pythagoras, there's no real evidence, but we know that Pythagoras in particular was associated with making that link between perfect form and beauty. Okay? He believed that order could be expressed numerically, that numbers could be organised to create shapes, that those shapes could come together and form the building blocks of the universe. So he made an important link between beauty and perfect form. 100 years later, we had Plato, who made the case for sensible beauty, beauty that could be felt through the senses, could be experienced through the senses. And he made the case for sensible, morally noble beauty. So that there was some form of ultimate beauty out there, and it was a good thing. It was morally noble. And then, at a similar time, Aristotle, and it's an appalling summary, I know, pulled together those two philosophies. And he argued that geometric forms are the ultimate building blocks of life. They are they are the reality of universal perfect order, and that perfection existed and manifested itself in truth, goodness and beauty. So I know that I've summarised that in an unforgivable way, and I could spend much longer on it, but I won't. But what these philosophies gave us was two things: a way of appreciating form and beauty, and the link between beauty and high value. And if I want to put that in easy words, there is, I think, as a direct result of these philosophies, a clear relationship between the notion of beauty and good. And actually, if you pull that apart, that leads us into a very different place. If you ask a child to draw a bad person, invariably they will draw somebody who doesn't conform to our notion of beauty. If you ask them to draw a good person, they do. So we have got this strange connection between good and beauty that really only exists in the Western world. Doesn't seem to exist in any other cultures. So we now find it very difficult to make objective value judgments on what we see, particularly in relation to landscape, where we might also have this unconscious hardwired response to our environment as a habitat. I want to touch on the philosophical work of someone called Immanuel Kant and someone called Edmund Burke. Immanuel Kant made the link between beauty and landscape, and he argued that you felt a sense of beauty because you couldn't actually resolve what you saw in front of you. It didn't actually make sense, there was too much going on, and actually that gave you this sense, this buzz, and actually there was a link there to beauty. Burke did a lot of work, Edmund Burke did a lot of work on the sublime, the issue of this, and you used the word sublime earlier on, so interesting how we use it. And he did a lot of work on the sublime, and I'll come back to the sublime in a minute, but he drove forward the picturesque movement. So by the end of the 18th century, we had a flourishing picturesque movement, where an integral component of natural beauty, we'd gone from this classical appreciation, an integral component was this appreciation of natural beauty, often augmented by something referred to as counterfeit neglect. So we had these visions of natural beauty characterised by things like the Wye Valley, where you have this, you have the tumbling river, you have the woodlands, you have the castles. It's all very framed, it's all very picturesque. But this notion of the sublime crept in, and this sublime was the agreeable horror associated with quite scary places. You know, mountains, they were a bit scary, you didn't really want to go there. But that sense of scariness, it was actually quite nice. So woodlands as well, forests, the dense wildwood, a little bit scary, but actually probably a good thing, probably nurturing, whatever. So we had this quite rapid change over the sort of the end of the 18th century, where we went from this classical appreciation of landscape form and order to this picturesque appreciation of landscape. And by the end of the 19th century, the aristocracy who'd previously trekked all over Europe to see these great landscapes found they couldn't because of the Napoleonic Wars, the beginning of the 1800s. So they looked closer to home, and the Grand Tour came into the UK, and we had the Grand Tour taking place in the Wye Valley, the Wye Tours, which you're probably all familiar with, the tours around North Wales looking at Snowdonia and all these other things, all these other places. But essentially they were based on appreciation of natural beauty that had on top of it this layer of the sublime, this agreeable horror. And for me, it's this notion of the sublime that helps create a special place for woodlands in our psyche. The notion of the wildwood, a place full of danger, as I mentioned earlier. So hopefully you've got a bit of an understanding as to where we are with landscape and how we got there. It isn't based on one single thing, it's based on this mixture of philosophy, value judgments, art and culture. It's complex, it's based in part on raw emotion, and it's no wonder that feelings run high when part of it comes under threat, such as it did during the discussions over the future of the forest estate. So what can we learn from what we know about landscape? I think the important thing is that people and place are integral. There should be no disconnect between people and place. So we need processes that will allow us to maintain that link between people and place. Now, there's lots of different ways of doing it, but we desperately need transparent mechanisms for sharing thoughts and ideas, defining outcomes, shared agreements on way forwards. If we don't understand the relationship people have with land in any given patch, then we have no understanding of the way that land functions, how people affect it and how it affects people. Landscape is as much about people as it is about the land. In areas of outstanding natural beauty and national parks, there is a planning process which tries to do it. It doesn't always succeed. It's not always the best way of doing it, but there are lots of ways of doing it. So we talk about ecological connectivity and the landscape approach. What's clear is that we can't continue to do things that we've been doing in the past in the policy world. We can't continue to repeat things as we've been doing them because they're evidently not working. And we can't scale it up to a landscape scale and continue to do the same things on a larger scale, because exponentially we're dealing with more problems. It's more complex. But what we can do is adopt a landscape approach, and that's very different. A landscape approach, in my mind, accepts the fact that ecological connectivity is fundamental, but it also accepts the fact that there's a connectivity associated with economics. There's an economic connectivity that we need to factor in, as there's a societal connectivity, a social connectivity. And I think, to me, that's an important point. Landscape scale work is not just about large-scale habitat restoration. It's about adopting a different approach, and it's about people. So I'm going to leave it at that. If you go away with the message from me that land policy is about passion and it's about turning it into action, but fundamentally landscapes are about people and place, and we ignore that at our peril, then I think I will have done a reasonable job. So thank you very much. We go away with some kind of, the delegates go away with a renewed direction, a clarity amongst themselves as to which direction they want to continue in. The fact that actually we can't look at policy development, we can't look at ideas detached from what it is we're talking about. It's actually sometimes very helpful to get out into the environment, experience it in whatever way is appropriate, and then use that experience in order to influence thoughts and change.